The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before Sarah Martinez as she stood on the concrete edge of the Naval Special Warfare Training Pool. At 26, she had already proven herself through months of grueling preparation, but today would test something deeper than physical strength. The water below reflected the harsh fluorescent lights of the training facility, creating an almost mirror-like surface that seemed to mock the chaos about to unfold beneath it. Instructor Chief Petty Officer James Hammer Harrison watched her from across the pool deck, his weathered face showing no emotion. He had seen hundreds of candidates attempt what Sarah was about to face, and very few emerged with their composure intact. The water confidence training was designed to break people, to strip away every pretense of control and reveal what lay beneath the surface of a person's character. Sarah adjusted her mask and checked her equipment one final time. The weight belt around her waist felt heavier than usual, loaded with enough lead to keep her anchored to the bottom of the 12-foot-deep pool. Her breathing apparatus, deliberately tampered with according to the training protocol, would malfunction at some point during the exercise. She wouldn't know when, and she wouldn't know how, but she knew it would happen. Around the pool, other instructors positioned themselves at various points, some in the water, others on the deck. They carried long poles and wore the expressions of predators waiting for their prey to show weakness. This wasn't just about swimming or holding one's breath. This was about maintaining clarity of thought when every instinct screamed panic. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training complex as other candidates lined up behind Sarah, each waiting their turn to face what many considered the most psychologically challenging aspect of SEAL training. Some shifted nervously from foot to foot, while others stood perfectly still, already trying to conserve their mental energy for what lay ahead. Chief Harrison raised his hand, and the facility fell silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the pool walls. Martinez, his voice cut through the morning air like a blade. You know the drill. Get to the bottom, stay calm, and remember that panic kills more operators than enemy bullets ever will. Sarah nodded once and stepped forward. Her bare feet found the pool's edge, toes curled around the concrete lip. She had trained for this moment for months, practicing breath control, underwater navigation, and equipment malfunction drills. But training in controlled conditions was vastly different from what she was about to experience. The water felt shockingly cold as she slipped beneath the surface, despite the California sun warming the deck above. Immediately, she descended toward the pool bottom, her weighted belt pulling her down with mechanical efficiency. The familiar sensation of water pressure building in her ears reminded her to equalize, an automatic response that had become second nature through countless hours of preparation. At the bottom of the pool, Sarah found her rhythm. The silence underwater was almost peaceful, broken only by the steady sound of her own breathing through the regulator. Above her, she could see the distorted figures of the instructors moving around the pool deck, their shapes wavering through the water like mirages in a desert. She began the prescribed exercises, moving methodically through a series of underwater tasks designed to test her ability to think clearly under pressure. First came the knot-tying exercise, her fingers working with practiced precision to create a series of increasingly complex knots using a length of rope. The water made everything more difficult, her movements slower and more deliberate than they would be on dry land. Minutes passed, and Sarah felt herself settling into a comfortable routine. Her breathing remained steady, her movements economical and purposeful. She had always been comfortable in the water, having grown up near the coast of California where swimming was as natural as walking. Her childhood had been spent diving for abalone and swimming in the cold Pacific waters off the coast of Monterey. But comfort was exactly what the instructors were determined to destroy. Without warning, Chief Harrison entered the water, his massive frame cutting through the liquid with surprising grace for such a large man. He approached Sarah from behind, his movements predatory and deliberate. She sensed his presence, but continued with her exercises, knowing that acknowledging the instructors too early would be seen as a sign of distraction. The first interference came as a gentle tug on her air hose. Sarah felt the slight resistance and adjusted her position slightly, maintaining her focus on the task at hand. She had been warned that the instructors would try to distract her, to create problems that would test her ability to prioritize, and remain calm under pressure. The tug came again, more insistent this time. Sarah's breathing remained steady, but she began to assess the situation with the peripheral awareness that had been drilled into her through months of training. The instructor was testing her, probing for weakness, looking for any sign that she might break under pressure. Suddenly, her air supply cut off completely. The silence that followed was profound and terrifying, the absence of the familiar hiss of compressed air filling her ears like a scream. Sarah's lungs, which had been comfortably processing the mechanical rhythm of breathing, suddenly felt the burning sensation of carbon dioxide buildup. This was the moment she had trained for, the crisis that separated the candidates who would continue in the program from those who would ring the bell and walk away from their dreams of becoming a SEAL. Sarah's mind immediately shifted into emergency mode, her training taking over as conscious thought stepped aside to let muscle memory and preparation guide her actions. She had perhaps 90 seconds of useful consciousness before the lack of oxygen would begin to seriously impair her judgment. In that time, she needed to identify the problem with her breathing apparatus and fix it, all while maintaining the calm demeanor that the instructors were watching for with microscopic attention. Her hands moved to the regulator, feeling along the familiar contours of the device that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The problem could be anywhere in the system, from a disconnected hose to a deliberately sabotaged valve. Her fingers traced the air delivery system with the methodical thoroughness of a surgeon examining a patient. Above her, more instructors had entered the water. She could sense their presence surrounding her, creating an additional layer of pressure beyond the physical demands of the exercise. They were there not just to ensure her safety, but to add to the psychological stress of the situation. Every movement she made was being evaluated, every micro-expression analyzed for signs of panic or loss of control. Sarah's lungs began to burn more insistently as the seconds ticked by. The carbon dioxide in her bloodstream was building up, creating the overwhelming urge to breathe that could drive even experienced divers to the surface in a desperate rush for air. But she had trained for this sensation, practicing breath-holding exercises that had pushed her body to its limits and beyond. Her exploring fingers found the problem, a loose connection where her primary regulator attached to the air supply. The fitting had been deliberately loosened, just enough to prevent air from flowing, but not so obvious that she would immediately recognize the issue. With movements that appeared almost casual to the observing instructors, Sarah tightened the connection. Air flooded back into her lungs with a rush that felt like salvation itself. But Sarah didn't gasp or show any outward sign of relief. Instead, she took 3 deep, controlled breaths and immediately returned to her exercises as if nothing had happened. The entire malfunction and repair had taken less than 45 seconds, well within the margins that separated competent operators from those who would never see combat. Chief Harrison, still positioned behind her, nodded almost imperceptibly to the other instructors. The first test had been passed, but they were far from finished with Sarah Martinez. If anything, her calm response to the emergency had marked her as someone who needed to be pushed even harder, tested more thoroughly. The underwater harassment continued with increasing intensity. Instructors began to interfere with her equipment more aggressively, tangling her air hoses, pulling at her mask, and creating a constant stream of problems that demanded her attention. Each interference was designed to build upon the previous one, creating a cascade of stress that would overwhelm all but the most mentally resilient candidates. Sarah's mask was suddenly ripped from her face, the seal breaking with a rush of water that flooded her nasal passages and eyes. The chlorinated pool water stung her eyes, making it difficult to see clearly, but she didn't surface or show any sign of distress. Instead, she calmly retrieved her mask, cleared it of water, and replaced it with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the exercise. Her air supply was cut off again, this time for longer. When it resumed, the flow was reduced to a barely adequate trickle that required her to work harder for each breath. The instructors had attached additional weights to her belt, making her negatively buoyant and forcing her to work constantly just to maintain her position in the water. Through it all, Sarah maintained the same calm demeanor that had characterized her performance from the beginning. Her movements remained economical and purposeful, her breathing controlled and steady when air was available. She approached each new challenge with the same methodical problem-solving approach, treating each crisis as simply another task to be completed rather than a threat to her survival. The psychological pressure was immense. Multiple instructors surrounded her now, their presence a constant reminder that she was being watched and evaluated. They moved around her like sharks circling prey, looking for any sign of weakness or panic that would indicate she wasn't suitable for the demands of special operations. But Sarah had trained for this mental aspect as intensively as the physical challenges. She had spent hours in meditation, learning to control her emotional responses and maintain clarity of thought even under extreme stress. Her background in competitive swimming had taught her to perform under pressure, and years of military training had honed her ability to function effectively when things went wrong. As the exercise continued, Sarah began to understand something that many candidates never grasped. The real test wasn't her ability to hold her breath or fix equipment underwater. The real test was her capacity to remain calm and think clearly when everything around her was designed to induce panic and confusion. The instructors weren't trying to drown her. They were trying to see if she possessed the mental toughness that would keep her alive and effective in combat situations where panic could mean death, not just for herself, but for her teammates. The water around her had become a battlefield, not against an external enemy, but against her own natural survival instincts. Every fiber of her being was programmed to rush to the surface when things went wrong underwater, to seek safety and air and the solid ground of the pool deck. Overriding those instincts required a level of mental discipline that few people possessed. Sarah's equipment was sabotaged again and again, each malfunction more complex than the last. Her weights were redistributed, making it difficult to maintain proper positioning. Her fins were loosened, threatening to slip off her feet at crucial moments. The instructors created a constant stream of problems that demanded her attention while simultaneously testing her ability to prioritize and maintain focus on the primary mission. Yet through each new challenge, Sarah's response remained the same. She identified the problem, solved it with minimal fuss, and returned to her exercises without showing any emotional reaction to the stress. Her breathing, when she had air, remained controlled and steady. Her movements stayed economical and purposeful, never wasting energy on unnecessary actions or emotional displays. The other candidates watching from the pool deck could see what was happening, and many began to understand the true nature of what they would soon face themselves. This wasn't just a test of physical capability. It was an examination of mental resilience that would determine whether they possessed the psychological tools necessary for special operations. As the exercise approached its end, Sarah had demonstrated Semethi 3 days had passed since Sarah's first water confidence exercise, and the training facility buzzed with a different kind of energy. Word had spread among the candidates about her performance, creating ripples of both inspiration and intimidation throughout the group. Some saw her success as proof that the exercises could be completed, while others worried that the instructors might raise the difficulty level for everyone based on her calm demonstration. Sarah stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the training facility, her breath visible in the cool morning air. The Pacific coast was notorious for its temperature swings, and the early morning hours carried a chill that penetrated even the wetsuit she wore beneath her training uniform. Around her, 23 other candidates prepared for what their schedule simply listed as advanced water training, a deliberately vague description that had kept most of them awake the previous night wondering what new challenges awaited. Chief Harrison emerged from the facility at precisely 0500 hours, his appearance marking the official beginning of what would prove to be one of the most grueling days of training any of them had yet experienced. Behind him walked 3 other instructors, each carrying equipment that the candidates couldn't quite identify in the dim light of the facility's exterior lighting. "Fall in." Harrison's command cut through the morning air with military precision. The candidates quickly formed ranks, their movements sharp and coordinated despite the early hour and the nervous energy that rippled through the group. Sarah took her position in the front rank, her posture reflecting the confidence she had gained from her previous success, while remaining appropriately humble in the face of unknown challenges. The chief instructor's eyes swept across the formation, pausing momentarily on each candidate as if taking inventory of their mental state. His experience had taught him to read the subtle signs of stress and anxiety that preceded either breakthrough performance or complete breakdown under pressure. Some candidates stood rigidly at attention, their tension visible in the set of their shoulders and the tightness around their eyes. Others swayed slightly on their feet, already showing signs of the fatigue that would become a constant companion as training intensified. "Today we escalate," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of experience in some of the world's most dangerous waters. "Yesterday's exercise was kindergarten compared to what's coming. You'll be working in pairs, and your partner's life will depend on your ability to maintain composure under pressure. Likewise, your survival will depend on their performance." The announcement sent a visible ripple through the formation. Working alone under pressure was one thing, but having responsibility for another person's safety added layers of psychological complexity that many candidates hadn't anticipated. Sarah felt her partner for the exercise step closer, a candidate named David Chun whose steady performance throughout previous training phases had earned him the respect of both instructors and fellow candidates. Chun was a former Marine reconnaissance specialist whose underwater skills rivaled those of many Navy personnel. His background in high-stress combat situations had prepared him well for the psychological demands of SEAL training, and Sarah felt confident that their partnership would be effective. More importantly, she sensed that he possessed the mental discipline necessary to remain calm when things went wrong, an essential quality for any exercise involving shared risk. The instructors led the group toward a different section of the training facility, past the familiar pool where Sarah had demonstrated her composure just days earlier. This new area featured a complex of interconnected tanks and pools designed to simulate the underwater environments that SEALs might encounter in operational settings. The water was darker, colder, and filled with obstacles that would challenge both navigation skills and psychological resilience. "This is the ship's simulator," explained instructor First Class Martinez, a veteran whose reputation for pushing candidates beyond their perceived limits was legendary throughout the SEAL training community. "You'll be conducting underwater ship attacks, emergency rescues, and equipment recovery operations. The difference is that today, everything that can go wrong will go wrong, and you'll have to solve problems while ensuring your partner survives." Sarah studied the facility with the analytical eye she had developed through months of training. The main tank was 30 feet deep and filled with mock ship structures, simulated hull sections, and a maze of obstacles designed to replicate the challenging underwater environment around enemy vessels. Visibility was deliberately limited, forcing candidates to rely on touch and systematic search patterns rather than visual navigation. The water temperature had been lowered to simulate Arctic conditions, adding another layer of stress that would test the candidate's ability to function effectively while dealing with the physical discomfort and mental challenges of cold water operations. Sarah had trained extensively in cold water, but she knew that the combination of low temperature, limited visibility, and equipment malfunctions would create a completely different level of challenge. Adjacent to the main tank was a smaller facility designed to simulate the interior spaces of a partially flooded ship. Candidates would need to navigate through narrow passages, around obstacles, and through areas where air pockets might or might not be available. The psychological pressure of operating in confined spaces while underwater would test their ability to manage claustrophobia and maintain clear thinking when escape routes were limited or uncertain. As the instructors explained the exercise parameters, Sarah began to understand the true complexity of what they would face. She and Chun would enter the water together, navigate to specific target points within the ship's simulator, complete assigned tasks, and return to the surface without losing contact with each other. Throughout the exercise, their equipment would be sabotaged, their air supplies interrupted, and their communication systems disabled at unpredictable intervals. The added element of partner responsibility fundamentally changed the psychological dynamics of the exercise. Sarah would need to monitor not only her own equipment and mental state, but also Chun's condition and performance. If he encountered problems, she would be expected to assist while continuing to complete her own assigned tasks. Conversely, If her equipment failed, her survival might depend on Chin's ability to share resources while maintaining his own operational effectiveness. Equipment check, Harrison commanded, and the candidates began the familiar ritual of inspecting their underwater gear. Sarah methodically examined her breathing apparatus, weight systems, and communication equipment, knowing that the instructors had already introduced malfunctions that she wouldn't discover until she was underwater and under stress. Her breathing apparatus felt slightly different from the previous exercise, heavier and less responsive when she tested the airflow. The weight distribution seemed normal, but she suspected that additional weights had been hidden within her equipment that would only become apparent once she was underwater and trying to maintain neutral buoyancy. Chin completed his own equipment check with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized all his actions. His military background had instilled in him the habit of triple-checking anything that might fail at a critical moment, and Sarah appreciated having a partner who understood the importance of preparation and attention to detail. The instructors divided the candidates into pairs and assigned each team specific entry points and mission objectives within the ship's simulator. Sarah and Chun were tasked with penetrating the simulated vessel, locating and retrieving a specific piece of equipment from the deepest section of the tank, and then conducting a mock rescue of a simulated casualty while navigating back to the surface. As they prepared to enter the water, Sarah felt the familiar combination of anticipation and controlled nervousness that preceded any challenging evolution. The water looked black and uninviting in the early morning light, its surface broken only by the geometric shapes of the simulated ship structures that jutted up from the bottom like the ribs of some mechanical sea monster. "Remember," Chin said quietly as they performed their final equipment checks, "we stay together no matter what happens. If one of us has a problem, we both have a problem. If one of us succeeds, we both succeed." Sarah nodded, appreciating both the reminder and the confidence in Chin's voice. Their partnership would be tested in ways that neither of them could fully anticipate, but she felt certain that their combined experience and training would see them through whatever challenges the instructors had prepared. The first pairs of candidates entered the water while Sarah and Chun waited their turn, watching as their teammates disappeared beneath the surface and into the maze of obstacles below. The instructors positioned themselves at various points around the facility, some in the water and others on elevated platforms that provided comprehensive observation of the exercise area. When their turn came, Sarah and Chun entered the water together, immediately feeling the shock of the reduced temperature as they descended toward their assigned entry point. The cold was more than just uncomfortable. It was a constant stressor that would sap their energy and mental focus throughout the exercise, adding another layer of difficulty to an already challenging evolution. Visibility in the water was limited to perhaps 3 feet, forcing them to navigate primarily by touch and compass bearing. The simulated ship structures loomed out of the murky water like ghosts, their angular shapes creating disorienting shadows and false passages that could easily lead unwary divers away from their objectives. Sarah's first equipment malfunction occurred within minutes of reaching the bottom of the tank. Her primary breathing regulator began delivering air in irregular spurts, creating the terrifying sensation of suffocation followed by relief as airflow resumed. The malfunction was subtle enough that she might have attributed it to normal equipment variation, but her training had taught her to recognize even minor anomalies as potential indicators of serious problems. She signaled to Chun, using the hand signals they had practiced extensively, and indicated the nature of her equipment problem. His response was immediate and professional, moving closer to share his air supply while she attempted to identify and correct the malfunction. The buddy breathing procedure was one they had practiced hundreds of times, but executing it under stress while navigating through obstacles added complexity that demanded their complete attention. Working together, they quickly identified that her regulator had been deliberately damaged, with a small obstruction inserted into the air delivery system that would cause intermittent blockages. The fix required her to partially disassemble the device while underwater, sharing air with Chun during the periods when she couldn't breathe independently. The repair took several minutes, during which time they fell behind the schedule they had been given for reaching their first objective. Sarah knew that the instructors were tracking their progress and that delays would be noted and evaluated as part of their overall performance. But she also understood that rushing the repair could result in a complete equipment failure that would force them to abort the exercise entirely. With her breathing system restored to full functionality, they continued their navigation toward the target area deeper within the simulated ship structure. The passages grew narrower and more confusing as they penetrated further into the maze, with dead ends and false routes that tested their ability to maintain orientation and systematic search patterns. Chin's equipment problems began as they reached the halfway point of their descent. His compass began providing erratic readings, spinning wildly, and making it impossible for him to maintain accurate navigation. Without reliable directional reference, they risked becoming lost in the maze of obstacles, potentially missing their objective entirely or, worse, becoming trapped in areas where emergency ascent might not be possible. Sarah took over primary navigation responsibilities, using her compass to guide them both, while Chin focused on monitoring their depth and air consumption rates. The role reversal required immediate adaptation and trust, as each of them had to rely completely on their partner's expertise in areas where their own equipment had failed. As they moved deeper into the simulated vessel, the psychological pressure of the confined spaces began to affect them both. The narrow passages and low overhead clearances created a sense of claustrophobia that challenged their training and mental discipline. Sarah could feel her breathing rate wanting to increase as the walls seemed to close in around them, but she forced herself to maintain the slow, controlled respiration that conserved air and kept her mind clear. Their target objective was located in a simulated engine room at the bottom of the tank, accessible only through a series of increasingly narrow passages that barely allowed them to pass through while wearing their equipment. The confined spaces made it impossible to swim side by side, forcing them to move in single file while maintaining physical contact to ensure they didn't become separated. Sarah led the way through the final approach, her hands feeling along the walls and obstacles in the murky water, while Chun followed closely behind, one hand on her tank to maintain contact. The darkness was so complete that their underwater flashlights, deliberately dimmed to simulate low battery conditions, provided only enough illumination to avoid immediate obstacles. When they reached the target area, they found their objective deliberately tangled in a web of cables and obstacles that would require careful manipulation to extract without causing damage. The simulated equipment was heavier than expected, requiring both of them working together to move it through the confined spaces they had just navigated. But their greatest challenge was yet to come. As they began the extraction process, both of their air supplies were simultaneously cut off, simulating a catastrophic failure of their breathing systems. The silence that followed was profound and terrifying, the absence of the familiar hiss of compressed air creating an immediate sense of emergency that demanded instant response. With no air available from their primary systems, Sarah and the training schedule had been deliberately vague about what would happen during week 3 of the water confidence phase, listing only stress inoculation training and performance under duress in the daily briefings. Sarah had learned to interpret such ambiguity as a warning that the instructors were preparing something designed to push candidates beyond anything they had previously experienced. Standing outside the training facility at 0400 hours, she could sense the change in atmosphere among her fellow candidates. The group that had started with 24 people now numbered only 18, with 6 candidates having voluntarily withdrawn from the program after discovering that their mental resilience had limits they hadn't known existed. The faces of those who remained showed the accumulated stress of weeks of intensive training, but also a hardened determination that spoke to their growing confidence in their abilities. Chief Harrison appeared without his usual punctuality, arriving 15 minutes late in a deliberate psychological tactic designed to increase anxiety among the waiting candidates. When he finally emerged from the facility, he was accompanied by a full team of safety divers and medical personnel, immediately signaling to everyone present that the day's exercises would involve genuine risk rather than the carefully controlled challenges they had faced previously. Today we find out who among you has what it takes to operate in a real crisis, Harrison announced, his voice carrying an edge that the candidates had learned to recognize as a prelude to particularly difficult training. You'll be working alone, underwater, in conditions designed to replicate the worst-case scenarios you might face in actual combat operations. Some of you won't finish today's exercise, and that's acceptable. What's not acceptable is quitting without trying. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that preceded any significant challenge, but her overall emotional state remained steady and focused. Her success in previous exercises had given her confidence in her ability to maintain composure under pressure, but she also understood that each new evolution was designed to test her at levels beyond what she had previously demonstrated. The facility they were led to that morning was unlike anything they had seen before in their training. Instead of the familiar pools and controlled water environments, they found themselves at the edge of a massive concrete structure that had been built to simulate a partially flooded building or ship compartment. The water was dark and cold, filled with obstacles, debris, and deliberately created hazards designed to challenge every aspect of their underwater skills. Multiple levels of the structure extended both above and below the waterline, connected by passages that ranged from comfortably wide to barely large enough for a single person to squeeze through while wearing full equipment. Some passages were completely flooded, while others contained air pockets of uncertain reliability. The entire structure had been designed to create the maximum possible psychological pressure while maintaining enough safety margin to prevent actual casualties. The scenario is simple, explained instructor First Class Rodriguez, whose reputation for creative and challenging training exercises was legendary among SEAL candidates. Each of you will enter the structure alone, navigate to a specific target location, complete an assigned task, and return to this starting point. The complication is that your route will take you through areas where your equipment will fail, where you'll lose communication with the surface, and where you'll face situations that have no clear or easy solutions. As Rodriguez spoke, Sarah studied the structure and began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just a test of underwater skills or equipment proficiency. It was a comprehensive examination of their ability to function independently under extreme stress, to make critical decisions without guidance or support, and to maintain operational effectiveness when everything seemed to be going wrong. The target locations were distributed throughout the structure, requiring each candidate to navigate through different combinations of flooded passages, confined spaces, and obstacle-filled chambers. Sarah's assignment took her to the lowest level of the structure, accessible only through a series of increasingly narrow passages that would test both her physical capabilities and her psychological resilience to confined spaces. Her equipment had been modified beyond anything she had experienced in previous training. Multiple failure points had been built into her breathing system. Her buoyancy control device had been tampered with to create unpredictable inflation and deflation, and her underwater communication system would cut out at predetermined intervals, leaving her isolated from any external support or guidance. The weight belt she wore was heavier than normal and had been distributed in a way that would make maintaining proper trim and balance more difficult throughout the exercise. Additional challenges had been incorporated into her gear, including a deliberately tangled equipment configuration that would create problems requiring immediate attention while she was trying to navigate through the most difficult sections of the course. As Sarah prepared for her entry into the structure, she reflected on the mental preparation techniques that had served her well in previous exercises. The key was to maintain awareness of the big picture while dealing effectively with immediate problems, to avoid becoming so focused on individual challenges that she lost track of her overall mission objectives. The water felt shockingly cold as she descended into the structure, immediately triggering the stress response that her training had taught her to recognize and manage. The first passage was relatively wide and straightforward, designed to allow candidates to adjust to the environment before the real challenges began. But even in this initial section, Sarah could feel the psychological pressure building as the walls closed in around her, and the familiar references of the surface world disappeared above her. Her first major equipment failure occurred as she reached the junction between the first and second levels of the structure. Her primary regulator began delivering air in irregular patterns, sometimes providing normal flow and sometimes reducing to a barely adequate trickle that forced her to work harder for each breath. The malfunction was subtle enough that she might have initially attributed it to her own anxiety, but her training had taught her to trust her perceptions and respond to problems before they became emergencies. The repair required her to partially disassemble her breathing system while maintaining her position in a narrow passage where any sudden movement might cause her to become wedged between obstacles. Working in the confined space with limited visibility, Sarah methodically traced through her equipment until she identified a deliberate obstruction that had been placed in her air delivery system. Removing the obstruction required precise manipulation of small components while wearing thick neoprene gloves and dealing with the reduced manual dexterity that resulted from the cold water and psychological stress. The repair took longer than she would have preferred, but she forced herself to work systematically rather than rushing and potentially creating additional problems. With her breathing system restored to normal function, Sarah continued her descent toward the target area. The passages grew progressively narrower and more complex, with obstacles positioned to force her into uncomfortable positions and psychological stress points designed to trigger claustrophobia in anyone susceptible to such reactions. The water became murkier as she descended, reducing visibility to less than 2 feet and forcing her to navigate primarily by touch and compass bearing. The psychological isolation was profound, with no communication to the surface possible and no awareness of how the other candidates were performing in their own sections of the structure. Sarah's buoyancy control system began malfunctioning as she reached the most confined section of her route, randomly inflating and deflating in ways that made it difficult to maintain proper positioning in the narrow passage. The uncontrolled buoyancy changes threatened to drive her into the overhead obstacles or to push her down into areas where she might become trapped or injured. Managing the buoyancy problem while continuing to navigate through the confined space required her to use manual techniques that she had learned but never practiced under such stressful conditions. She had to constantly adjust her position and breathing patterns to compensate for the unpredictable behavior of her equipment, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging evolution. The target area she finally reached was a small chamber at the bottom of the structure, accessible only through a passage so narrow that she had to remove some of her equipment and push it ahead of her while squeezing through the opening. The chamber contained a specific piece of equipment that she was required to retrieve and return to the surface, but accessing it required her to solve a complex mechanical puzzle while dealing with her ongoing equipment malfunctions. The puzzle itself was designed to test her problem-solving abilities under stress, requiring her to manipulate a series of interconnected mechanical components in a specific sequence while working in confined space with limited visibility. The solution wasn't immediately obvious, and the pressure to complete the task quickly was intensified by her awareness that her air supply was limited and that any delay might compromise her ability to return safely to the surface. As Sarah worked on the mechanical puzzle, her communication system failed completely, cutting off any possibility of receiving guidance or reporting her status to the surface support team. The silence was profound and disorienting, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the sounds of her own breathing and equipment in the confined chamber. The isolation triggered a psychological response that she had to actively manage, fighting against the natural human tendency to feel panic when cut off from external support and communication. Her training had prepared her for this moment, teaching her that panic was always a choice and that maintaining calm analytical thinking was the key to successful problem-solving under pressure. Working methodically through the MECHAN 6 weeks into the water confidence phase of SEAL training, Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of what the instructors called the ultimate assessment, a 48-hour evolution that would combine every skill, every lesson, and every psychological challenge she had faced throughout her journey. The training facility was unusually quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, with only the essential personnel present for what many considered the most comprehensive test of a candidate's readiness for naval special warfare operations. The group of candidates had dwindled to just 12 individuals, each having proven their basic competency in previous exercises, but now facing a comprehensive evaluation that would determine who among them possessed the complete package of skills, mental resilience, and adaptability required for actual SEAL operations. The attrition rate had been higher than normal for this training cycle, partly due to the increased emphasis on psychological resilience that had characterized Sarah's class. Chief Harrison looked older and more worn than he had at the beginning of the training cycle, the accumulated stress of evaluating and training candidates having taken its toll even on his experienced frame. But his eyes remained sharp and analytical as he studied the 12 remaining candidates, each of whom represented hundreds of hours of intensive training and evaluation. "This is it," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Everything you've learned, everything you've proven, everything you think you know about yourselves will be tested over the next 2 days. Some of you will discover that you're stronger than you believed possible. Others will find that they've reached their limits. Both outcomes are acceptable, but quitting without giving everything you have is not." The ultimate assessment facility was unlike anything the candidates had previously encountered. Built to simulate the most challenging underwater environments that SEALs might face in actual operations, it combined elements from every previous exercise while adding new dimensions of complexity and stress that would test their complete range of capabilities. The facility consisted of multiple interconnected environments, a simulated submarine infiltration course, an underwater demolition range, a combat swimming obstacle course, and a series of confined space rescue scenarios. Each environment would be completed in sequence, with no breaks for rest or equipment maintenance between phases. Candidates would carry all their equipment throughout the entire evolution, managing their resources and maintaining their gear while facing continuous challenges. Sarah's equipment loadout for the assessment was the most comprehensive she had ever carried. In addition to her basic underwater breathing and navigation gear, she carried simulated explosive devices, rescue equipment, communication systems, and enough supplies to sustain her through the 48-hour evolution. The weight of the equipment was significant, adding another layer of physical challenge to what was already a comprehensive test of mental and technical capabilities. The first phase took place in the Submarine Infiltration Simulator, a facility designed to replicate the exact conditions SEALs would face when approaching enemy vessels underwater. The environment featured realistic underwater terrain, patrol patterns by simulated enemy divers, and detection systems that would identify candidates who failed to maintain proper stealth protocols. Sarah entered the water at 0200 hours, beginning her infiltration approach under cover of complete darkness. The water was colder than any previous exercise, requiring her to manage the physiological stress of hypothermia while maintaining the precise navigation and stealth techniques essential for successful infiltration operations. Her route to the target required her to navigate through a series of underwater obstacle fields while avoiding detection by roving instructor divers who represented enemy sentries. The detection protocols were realistic and unforgiving. Any candidate discovered by the patrol teams would be immediately failed from this phase of the assessment. The navigation challenges were more complex than anything she had previously encountered, requiring her to use multiple navigation techniques simultaneously while maintaining perfect buoyancy control and minimizing any disturbance that might reveal her presence. Her compass bearings had to be precise to within degrees, her depth control exact to within inches, and her movement patterns timed to avoid the patrol schedules that she had been given only general information about. Halfway through the infiltration phase, Sarah encountered her first major equipment challenge. Her primary navigation system began providing erratic readings, forcing her to switch to backup navigation methods while maintaining her schedule and avoiding detection. The transition from electronic to manual navigation required her to recalculate her entire approach route while submerged and under time pressure. Her backup compass had also been sabotaged, providing readings that were off by a deliberate but unknown amount. Determining the error factor required her to use celestial navigation techniques adapted for underwater use, taking bearings on known reference points, and calculating her true position through triangulation methods that demanded complete concentration and precise mathematical calculation. The target itself was a simulated submarine mock-up positioned at the maximum depth of the training facility. Reaching it required Sarah to descend to 90 feet, while managing the increased nitrogen narcosis effects that could impair judgment and reaction time at depth. The psychological pressure of operating at the limits of safe diving depth added another dimension to the challenge. Her assigned task at the target was to plant simulated explosive charges at specific locations on the submarine mock-up, requiring her to solve complex mechanical puzzles while working at depth with limited visibility and impaired manual dexterity. The placement had to be precise according to technical specifications, and any errors would be detected by sensors that would automatically fail her from this portion of the assessment. Working at 90 feet, Sarah felt the familiar effects of nitrogen narcosis beginning to cloud her thinking. The condition, sometimes called rapture of the deep, created a form of underwater intoxication that could lead to poor judgment and potentially fatal mistakes. Managing the narcosis while completing precise technical tasks required her to rely heavily on her training and to maintain constant awareness of her mental state. The simulated explosive devices were more complex than anything she had worked with in previous training, requiring her to follow detailed technical procedures while dealing with the narcosis effects and the time pressure of avoiding detection by patrol teams. Each device had to be armed according to specific protocols, positioned with millimeter precision, and activated in a precise sequence that would simulate a coordinated attack on multiple target points. Completing the submarine phase took Sarah nearly 4 hours, during which time she had to manage her air consumption carefully to ensure she had sufficient breathing gas for the ascent and transition to the next phase of the assessment. The cold water and physical demands of the exercise had increased her air consumption rate beyond normal parameters, requiring her to use advanced gas management techniques to complete all required tasks. Her ascent from the target depth was controlled and methodical, following decompression protocols that would prevent nitrogen bubbles from forming in her bloodstream. The ascent took 20 minutes, during which time she had to complete additional navigation challenges and avoid detection by surface patrol units that were specifically watching for ascending candidates. The transition between the first and second phases of the assessment provided no opportunity for rest or equipment maintenance. Sarah immediately moved to the underwater demolition range, where she would face challenges designed to test her ability to work with explosive materials in underwater environments while dealing with the accumulated fatigue from the infiltration phase. The demolition range featured realistic underwater target structures that had to be destroyed using simulated explosive charges while following strict safety protocols and achieving specific damage objectives. The targets were positioned at various depths and locations throughout the facility, requiring Sarah to navigate between them while carrying increasingly heavy loads of simulated explosives. Her first demolition target was a simulated bridge support positioned in 40 feet of water and defended by underwater obstacles designed to make access difficult and dangerous. Reaching the target required her to navigate through a maze of cables, debris, and structural elements that could easily snag her equipment or cause injury if she made any careless movements. The explosive placement required her to calculate the exact positioning and orientation needed to achieve the required structural damage while minimizing collateral effects. The calculations had to be performed underwater using waterproof reference materials while dealing with the accumulated fatigue from the previous phase and the ongoing equipment malfunctions that continued to plague her breathing and navigation systems. Each demolition target presented unique challenges that tested different aspects of her technical knowledge and practical skills. Some required her to work in confined spaces where equipment removal was necessary. Others demanded precise timing coordination between multiple explosive devices, and several involved complex calculations that had to be verified multiple times to ensure accuracy. The psychological pressure of working with explosive materials, even simulated ones, added another layer of stress to the assessment. Any error in calculation, placement, or timing could theoretically result in mission failure or casualties, requiring Sarah to maintain perfect attention to detail while dealing with fatigue, equipment problems, and the accumulated stress of hours of intensive underwater operations. Between demolition targets, Sarah faced a series of combat swimming challenges designed to test her ability to move quickly and efficiently through water while carrying heavy loads and maintaining tactical awareness. The combat swimming course featured obstacles that required her to climb, crawl, and squeeze through while submerged, testing both her physical capabilities and her mental resilience to confined spaces. The course was designed to be completed in specific time limits that would test her ability to balance speed with safety and precision. Moving too slowly would result in failure to meet the assessment standards, but moving too quickly could result in equipment damage or safety violations that would also result in automatic failure from the program. Sarah's equipment continued to develop new problems throughout the demolition phase, requiring her to constantly adapt her techniques and procedures to work around malfunctions while maintaining the performance standards expected of SEAL operators. Her breathing system developed an air leak that forced her to monitor her gas consumption more carefully. Her buoyancy control became increasingly unreliable, and her underwater communication system failed completely during the most critical portions of the exercise. The third phase of the assessment took place in a confined space rescue simulator designed to test her ability to operate in the most psychologically challenging underwater environments. The facility featured a series of interconnected chambers and passages that simulated the interior spaces of a sunken ship, requiring her to navigate through areas where claustrophobia and panic were constant threats. Her mission in the confined space facility was to locate and rescue a series of simulated casualties positioned throughout the structure, each presenting unique challenges that would test different aspects of her rescue training. Some casualties were positioned in areas accessible only by removing and replacing equipment multiple times. Others required complex medical procedures to stabilize before evacuation, and several were located in areas where air pockets of uncertain reliability provided the only breathing space available. The first casualty was located in a chamber accessible only through a passage so narrow that Sarah had to exhale completely and squeeze through while pushing her equipment ahead of her. The casualty simulation was realistic and disturbing, requiring her to perform simulated medical procedures while dealing with the psychological stress of working in extremely confined conditions. Evacuation of the first casualty required her to drag the simulated victim through the same narrow passage, a process that took nearly an hour and required her to remove and replace her equipment multiple times while ensuring that the casualty remained properly secured and positioned. The physical demands of the evacuation pushed her to her limits, testing both her strength and her mental resilience. Subsequent rescue scenarios became progressively more challenging, with casualties positioned in areas that required increasingly complex navigation and evacuation procedures. Some rescues required her to share her breathing gas with the simulated victims while evacuating through areas where air pockets were not available. Others involved casualties with simulated injuries that required immediate medical attention before movement was possible. The most challenging rescue scenario placed a casualty in an area that could only be reached by swimming completely submerged through a series of interconnected chambers with no available air pockets. The approach required her to hold her breath for extended periods while carrying rescue equipment and navigating through confined spaces, testing the absolute limits of her breath-holding capabilities and psychological resilience. Throughout the rescue phase, Sarah's ACU 3 months later, Sarah Martinez stood on the deck of a Navy destroyer somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, watching as a new class of SEAL candidates prepared for their first real-world training exercise. The sun reflected off the water with a brilliance that reminded her of those early morning hours at the training facility, but the context was entirely different now. She wore the uniform of a naval special warfare operator, having successfully completed not just the water confidence phase, but the entire SEAL training program. The candidates below looked exactly as nervous and uncertain as she had felt during her own first exercises, their movements betraying the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that characterized everyone facing the unknown challenges of special operations training. But Sarah now understood something about that nervousness that had taken her months to fully comprehend during her own journey through the program. Chief Harrison had been right when he told them that the water confidence training wasn't really about swimming or holding their breath or fixing equipment underwater. It was about discovering something fundamental about human nature and about the choices people make when everything seems to be falling apart around them. Sarah's role on this exercise was as an observer and safety coordinator, positioned to ensure that the training remained challenging but safe as the new candidates faced their own trials in the water. Her experience had qualified her to recognize the signs of genuine distress versus manageable stress, and her calm demeanor under pressure made her an ideal mentor for candidates who were struggling with the psychological demands of the training. As she watched the first candidate enter the water for what she recognized as a basic equipment malfunction drill, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The progression from that first tentative descent into the training pool to her current position as a qualified SEAL operator seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet every step had been documented and verified through the most comprehensive evaluation process she had ever encountered. The candidate in the water below was experiencing his first major breathing equipment failure, and Sarah could see the initial signs of panic beginning to manifest in his movements and body language. His breathing rate increased, his movements became less controlled, and his problem-solving approach became reactive rather than systematic. These were exactly the responses that the instructors were looking for, not because they wanted candidates to fail, but because they needed to understand each person's baseline response to crisis situations. "What are you thinking, Martinez?" asked Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells, the exercise coordinator who had been Sarah's final phase instructor during her own training. Wells had a reputation for being able to read candidates' mental states with uncanny accuracy, and her question indicated that she was interested in Sarah's assessment of the struggling candidate's performance. Sarah studied the candidate's movements for several more seconds before responding. "He's fighting the problem instead of solving it," she observed. "His breathing rate tells me he's moving toward panic, but his equipment manipulation shows he still has cognitive function. He'll either figure out that panic is a choice in the next 30 seconds, or he'll surface, and we'll have to have a conversation about mental discipline." The assessment proved accurate. The candidate's movements became increasingly erratic until he finally abandoned his systematic approach to the equipment problem and headed for the surface in a rush that indicated complete loss of composure. As he broke the surface of the water, gasping and showing clear signs of panic, Sarah felt a mixture of sympathy and professional disappointment that she had learned to recognize as part of the evaluation process. "Surface discipline needs work," Wells commented as safety divers moved to assist the candidate. "But that wasn't a safety emergency, just a failure of mental preparation. We'll work with him." The comment reminded Sarah of her own struggles during the early phases of training, when maintaining composure under pressure had required conscious effort and deliberate application of mental techniques that hadn't yet become automatic responses. She remembered the burning sensation in her lungs when her air supply was cut off, the disorientation of losing visual references in murky water, and the psychological pressure of operating alone in confined spaces with no communication to the surface. But she also remembered the moment when she had realized that panic was indeed a choice, and that choosing to remain calm and analytical even when every instinct screamed otherwise was perhaps the most important skill any special operator could possess. That realization had come not through any single dramatic incident, but through the accumulated experience of dozens of exercises that had each pushed her slightly beyond her previous comfort zone. The next candidate entering the water showed more promise, her movements deliberate and controlled as she descended toward the exercise area. Sarah recognized the signs of someone who had prepared mentally as well as physically for the challenges ahead, and she felt a sense of professional satisfaction in watching competent performance under pressure. "This one's different," Wells observed, watching the candidate's smooth transition from surface to underwater operations. "She's been thinking about this, preparing for it. Watch her breathing pattern." Sarah nodded, recognizing the controlled respiratory rhythm that indicated both physical fitness and mental discipline. The candidate's equipment manipulation was systematic and efficient, showing that she had practiced the procedures until they became automatic responses rather than conscious actions requiring mental effort. When the inevitable equipment malfunction occurred, the candidate's response was immediate and professional. Her breathing pattern remained unchanged, her movements stayed controlled and purposeful, and her problem-solving approach followed the systematic methodology that characterized successful special operations personnel. Within 60 seconds, she had identified and corrected the malfunction and resumed her assigned tasks as if nothing had happened. That's how it's supposed to look, Wells commented with professional approval. She'll do fine in this program. The observation reminded Sarah of her own progression through increasingly difficult challenges, each designed to test a different aspect of her mental and physical capabilities. The instructors had been skilled at identifying the specific areas where each candidate needed additional development, creating individualized challenges that pushed everyone to their personal limits while maintaining enough safety margin to prevent actual casualties. Sarah's own breakthrough moment had come during the confined space rescue exercises, when she had finally understood that her calm under pressure wasn't just a useful characteristic, but an essential tool that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The realization had transformed her approach to training from simply trying to survive each exercise to actively seeking opportunities to develop and refine her crisis management capabilities. As the morning exercises continued, Sarah found herself analyzing not just the candidate's performance, but her own growth as an operator. The person who had stood nervously at the pool edge months earlier seemed like a different individual, someone who had possessed the basic capabilities but lacked the confidence and experience that only came through successfully overcoming genuine challenges. The water confidence phase had taught her that competence under pressure was built through repeated exposure to manageable stress, with each successful experience building the mental foundation necessary for handling increasingly difficult situations. The progression had been carefully designed to ensure that candidates developed genuine capabilities rather than just temporary responses that might fail under the extreme stress of actual combat operations. "You've been quiet this morning," Wells observed during a brief break between exercise rotations. "What's on your mind?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I'm thinking about how different this all looks from the instructor side," she said. "When I was going through the program, everything seemed designed to break us, to find our limits, and push us beyond them. Now I can see that it was really about building us up, giving us tools and confidence that we couldn't have developed any other way." Wells nodded with the understanding of someone who had guided hundreds of candidates through similar realizations. "That's the difference between training and education," she explained. "Training teaches you procedures and techniques. Education changes who you are fundamentally. SEAL training is education disguised as training." The comment resonated with Sarah's understanding of her own transformation through the program. The person who had completed the ultimate assessment was fundamentally different from the person who had started the water confidence phase, not just in terms of skills and capabilities, but in her understanding of human potential and the nature of performance under extreme stress. The afternoon brought more advanced exercises, with candidates facing multi-phase challenges that required them to maintain performance standards while dealing with accumulated fatigue and increasing psychological pressure. Sarah recognized the progression that had characterized her own training, the gradual escalation of demands that ensured each new challenge built upon previous successes while introducing new variables that tested adaptability and mental resilience. One candidate particularly caught her attention, a young man whose initial performance had been marginal, but whose improvement trajectory suggested genuine learning and adaptation. His movements were becoming more confident with each exercise, his problem-solving more systematic, and his responses to equipment failures more professional. "He's starting to get it," Sarah observed to Wells as they watched the candidate work through a complex equipment malfunction while maintaining his assigned navigation tasks. "You can see the moment when training becomes instinct." The transformation was visible in subtle changes in the candidate's approach to challenges. Instead of treating each new problem as a crisis requiring immediate reactive response, he had begun to assess situations systematically and apply appropriate solutions based on established procedures and logical analysis. His breathing remained controlled under stress, his movements stayed economical and purposeful, and his focus remained on mission accomplishment rather than personal comfort or convenience. "That's what we're looking for," Wells confirmed. "The ability to function professionally when things go wrong, to maintain standards when it would be easier to compromise, and to support teammates even when you're dealing with your own challenges." The comment reminded Sarah of the partnership exercises that had taught her about the interconnected nature of team performance under stress. Her success in later phases of training had depended not just on her individual capabilities, but on her ability to function as part of a team where everyone's performance affected everyone else's chances of success. As the exercise day concluded and the candidates began their equipment cleaning and maintenance routines, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned not just about underwater operations, but about human nature and the development of expertise under pressure. The Water Confidence Program had been designed by people who understood that true competence came not from avoiding challenges, but from successfully overcoming them repeatedly until excellence became a habit rather than an exception. The candidates were beginning to learn what Sarah now understood intuitively. That calm under pressure wasn't a personality trait that some people possessed and others lacked, but a skill that could be developed through proper training and mental preparation. The key was understanding that panic was always a choice, and that choosing analytical thinking over emotional reaction was possible even in the most stressful situations. "What's your assessment of today's group?" Wells asked as they prepared to head back to the ship for debriefing and planning for the next day's exercises. Sarah considered the question carefully, thinking about each candidate's performance and progression throughout the day. "They're learning," she said finally. "Some faster than others, but they're all beginning to understand that the real enemy isn't the water or the equipment failures or the physical challenges. The real enemy is their own tendency to panic when things don't go according to plan." The observation reflected her own hard-won understanding of the psychological aspects of special operations training. The physical challenges were significant, but they were manageable for anyone with adequate preparation and fitness. The mental challenges were what separated those who would complete the program from those who would discover that their limits were lower than they had believed. As Sarah looked out over the Pacific Ocean that evening, she understood that her journey through SEAL training had taught her something valuable, not just about military operations, but about human potential in general. The water confidence phase had shown her that people were capable of far more than they typically believed possible, but that realizing that potential required them to choose courage over comfort and systematic thinking over emotional reaction when facing the unknown challenges that life inevitably presented. The calm that had served her so well throughout training was no longer just a response to specific water-related challenges. It had become a fundamental part of her approach to any difficult situation. A learned ability to maintain analytical thinking and professional performance even when circumstances seemed overwhelming or impossible to manage. Chief Harrison's words from that first day had proven prophetic. They had indeed learned how calm a SEAL could stay under pressure. But, more importantly, they had discovered that such calmness wasn't a mysterious quality possessed by a special few, but a learnable skill that could be developed by anyone willing to face their fears, overcome their limitations, and choose growth over comfort when confronted with challenges that seemed beyond their capabilities. The water had been their teacher, but the real lesson had been about the choices people make when everything seems to be falling apart around them. Sarah had learned to choose calm, analytical thinking over panic, systematic problem-solving over reactive responses, and mission accomplishment over personal comfort. Those choices had transformed her not just into a capable special operator, but into someone who understood that human potential was limited more by mental barriers than by physical ones. As the ship headed back to port, Sarah knew that her real education was just beginning. The water confidence phase had given her the foundation, but actual operations would provide opportunities to apply and refine these lessons in situations where the stakes were real and the margin for error was non-existent. But she also knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she possessed the mental tools necessary to face them with the same calm competence that had carried her through the most demanding training program in the world. The water had tested her and found her ready. Now it was time to put that readiness to use in service of something larger than herself, secure in the knowledge that she could maintain her composure and effectiveness no matter how much pressure the situation might generate. She had learned not just how to be calm under pressure, but how to choose calmness as a deliberate response to whatever challenges the future might bring. Mulat fatigue from the previous 18 hours of intensive exercise began to affect her performance in subtle but measurable ways. Her reaction times were slower, her problem-solving required more conscious effort, and her physical capabilities were diminished by the constant stress and exertion of the assessment. But even as her physical capabilities declined, Sarah's mental approach remained consistent with her performance throughout the entire training program. She continued to treat each new challenge as a problem to be solved rather than a crisis to be endured, maintained systematic approaches to complex tasks, and demonstrated the kind of calm professionalism that characterized successful special operations personnel. The final phase of the ultimate assessment was designed as a comprehensive integration of all the skills and mental qualities that had been tested throughout the previous phases. Sarah was required to plan and execute a complex multi-phase mission that included elements of infiltration, demolition, rescue, and intelligence gathering, all while operating independently and making critical decisions without external guidance or support. Her mission planning had to be completed underwater using waterproof reference materials while dealing with the accumulated effects of more than 30 hours of continuous operations. The plan had to account for multiple contingencies, include detailed timing sequences, and demonstrate understanding of the complex relationships between all the different mission elements. Executing the plan required Sarah to demonstrate mastery of every technical skill she had learned while maintaining the mental clarity necessary for complex decision-making under extreme stress. Equipment failures continued to occur at unpredictable intervals, forcing her to adapt her plans and procedures while maintaining focus on mission accomplishment. The psychological pressure of the final phase was immense, representing the culmination of months of training and the final determination of whether she possessed what it took to become a SEAL. Every action was evaluated, every decision analyzed, and every response measured against the standards that had been developed through decades of special operations experience. When Sarah finally surfaced after completing the ultimate assessment, she had been underwater or in water-related activities for 46 hours and 37 minutes. She had overcome dozens of equipment failures, solved complex technical problems under extreme stress, completed multiple rescue scenarios, and demonstrated the kind of mental resilience that defined naval special warfare operators. Chief Harrison was waiting at the pool edge with the complete evaluation team, their expressions revealing nothing about her performance, but their presence indicating the significance of what she had just accomplished. The debrief that followed would take hours and would cover every aspect of her performance in microscopic detail. But as Sarah began the process of equipment removal and preparation for evaluation, she already knew that she had proven something important about herself and about the nature of human performance under extreme stress. She had maintained her composure and effectiveness through challenges that had been specifically designed to break her, demonstrating that her calm under pressure was not just a temporary characteristic, but a fundamental part of her character that would serve her well in the demanding world of special operations. Puzzle. Sarah eventually identified the correct sequence of actions required to access the target equipment. The solution required her to coordinate multiple simultaneous actions while maintaining her position in the confined space, demonstrating the kind of complex problem-solving ability that would be essential in actual combat operations. But retrieving the equipment was only half of her challenge. The return journey to the surface would test her ability to navigate through the same confined spaces while carrying additional gear and dealing with equipment that continued to malfunction at unpredictable intervals. The added burden of the retrieved equipment changed her buoyancy characteristics and made movement through the narrow passages more difficult. Her ascent through the structure became a test of her ability to manage multiple simultaneous problems while maintaining focus on her primary objective of returning safely to the surface. Her buoyancy control system continued to malfunction. Her breathing apparatus developed new problems that required constant attention, and the retrieved equipment threatened to snag on obstacles or become wedged in the narrow passages. Halfway through her ascent, Sarah encountered a challenge that hadn't been present during her descent. One of the passages that had been opened during her initial navigation was now partially blocked by a movable obstacle that could only be cleared by solving another mechanical puzzle while positioned in an extremely confined space. The secondary puzzle was more complex than the first, requiring her to manipulate components that were positioned outside her direct line of sight, while working entirely by feel through thick gloves. The solution process was complicated by her continuing equipment malfunctions and the psychological pressure of being trapped in a confined space until she could clear the obstruction. As she worked on the puzzle, Sarah's air supply began running lower than she had anticipated, partly due to the extended time required to solve the various mechanical challenges, and partly because her equipment malfunctions had forced her to work harder and consume air at a higher rate than normal. The awareness that her breathing gas was becoming limited added urgency to her problem-solving efforts without causing her to rush or panic. The solution to the secondary puzzle required her to coordinate actions between her hands and feet, using her fins to manipulate components that she couldn't reach with her arms while simultaneously working on other parts of the mechanism with her hands. The coordination challenge was made more difficult by the confined space and the need to maintain precise positioning to avoid becoming stuck or injured. When the obstruction finally cleared, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction and relief, but she immediately refocused her attention on the continuing ascent and the equipment problems that still demanded her attention. Her breathing system had developed a new malfunction that caused air to be delivered in sudden surges followed by periods of reduced flow, creating a respiratory pattern that challenged her ability to maintain calm, controlled breathing. The final stages of her ascent took her through areas where she had to remove and replace her equipment multiple times to navigate through particularly confined passages. Each equipment removal and replacement cycle created opportunities for additional problems to develop, testing her ability to maintain systematic approaches to problem-solving even when under severe time pressure. Her emergence from the structure felt like a rebirth, the sudden transition from the confined underwater environment to the open air of the training facility providing immediate psychological relief. But even as she surfaced, Sarah maintained the calm professional demeanor that had characterized her performance throughout the exercise, showing no outward signs of the stress and challenge she had just overcome. Chief Harrison was waiting at the pool edge as she completed her equipment removal and preparation for debrief. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah detected a slight nod of approval that indicated her performance had met the standards expected of potential SEAL operators. Time from entry to surface: 42 minutes, 18 seconds, Harrison announced. Equipment retrieval confirmed, all assigned tasks completed, no safety violations noted. The debrief that followed was comprehensive and detailed, with the instructors analyzing every aspect of her performance from entry through surface recovery. Her ability to solve complex problems while managing multiple equipment failures had impressed even the most experienced instructors, demonstrating the kind of mental resilience and adaptability that would be essential in actual combat operations. As Sarah cleaned and inspected her equipment after the exercise, she reflected on what she had learned about herself and about the nature of stress inoculation training. The exercise had pushed her beyond her previous experience in terms of psychological pressure and problem complexity, but her fundamental approach had remained consistent with her earlier performances. She had maintained analytical thinking under pressure, treated each new challenge as a problem to be solved rather than a crisis to be endured, and demonstrated the kind of calm professionalism that would allow her to function effectively in the high-stress environment of special operations. More importantly, she had proven to herself that her mental resilience could be maintained even when operating alone without external support or communication. The completion of the stress inoculation exercise marked another milestone in her progression through SEAL training. But Sarah understood that each success raised the bar for future challenges. The instructors would continue to find new ways to test her limits, to push her beyond her comfort zone, and to prepare her for the kinds of situations she might face in actual combat operations. As she prepared for the next phase of training, Sarah felt a growing confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. The water had tested her at levels she hadn't known existed, and she had emerged not just intact but stronger and more capable than before. Her journey toward earning the SEAL trident continued, but She now possessed the proven knowledge that she could maintain her composure and effectiveness under even the most extreme pressure. Hen had to implement the emergency procedures they had practiced but never used in such a confined and stressful environment. They activated their emergency air supplies, small bottles that contained just enough compressed air to allow them to reach the surface if used efficiently. The emergency ascent with their retrieved equipment required perfect coordination and timing. They had to move quickly enough to reach the surface before their limited air supplies ran out, but carefully enough to avoid decompression injuries and to navigate through the obstacles between them and safety. Any mistake in navigation or timing could result in drowning in the confined spaces of the simulated vessel. Working as a perfectly synchronized team, they began their emergency ascent, sharing air when necessary and taking turns leading the navigation through the complex route back to open water. Sarah's calm demeanor, proven in previous exercises, became a stabilizing influence that helped Chun maintain his focus even as their air supplies dwindled and the pressure to reach the surface mounted. Their emergence into the open area of the main tank felt like a rebirth, the sudden absence of confining walls and obstacles providing psychological relief even as they continued their controlled ascent toward the surface. But they weren't finished yet. The exercise required them to complete a simulated rescue of a training dummy positioned at mid-depth, adding another layer of complexity to their emergency ascent. The rescue portion of the exercise tested their ability to maintain teamwork and focus even when their own survival was at stake. They had to secure the simulated casualty and bring it to the surface while continuing to share their diminishing air supplies and navigate around the remaining obstacles in the facility. When they finally broke the surface of the water, Sarah and Chun had been underwater for 18 minutes, had overcome multiple equipment failures, navigated through confined spaces in near-zero visibility, retrieved their assigned equipment, and completed a rescue operation. More importantly, they had done it while maintaining the professional calm and systematic approach that characterized successful special operations personnel. Chief Harrison was waiting for them at the pool edge, his expression revealing nothing about their performance. As they handed over their retrieved equipment and helped the simulated casualty onto the deck, Sarah realized that this exercise had tested something beyond individual capability. It had examined their ability to function as a team under extreme stress, to maintain trust and communication when everything seemed to be failing, and to put mission accomplishment above personal comfort or safety. The debrief that followed was thorough and professional, with the instructors analyzing every aspect of their performance from entry to surface. Their equipment malfunctions had been more severe than those faced by some other teams, but their response had been textbook perfect, demonstrating the kind of adaptability and teamwork that would be essential in actual combat operations. As Sarah cleaned her equipment and prepared for the next evolution, she reflected on what she had learned about herself and about the nature of special operations. The exercise had proven that her individual calm under pressure could be maintained even when she was responsible for another person's safety. More importantly, it had shown that true operational effectiveness came not from individual heroics, but from the seamless integration of skills, trust, and professional competence that characterized the best military teams. That impressed even the most experienced instructors. She had maintained her composure under extreme stress, solved multiple equipment failures while oxygen deprived, and shown the kind of mental toughness that suggested she might actually have what it took to complete the full SEAL training program. When Chief Harrison finally signaled for her to surface, Sarah rose from the bottom of the pool with the same controlled movements she had displayed throughout the exercise. She broke the surface of the water without gasping or showing any sign of distress, treading water calmly as the instructors gathered around to debrief the exercise. "Time," Harrison called out, his voice carrying across the pool area. 12 minutes, 47 seconds. Sarah had remained underwater, dealing with constant equipment failures and psychological pressure for nearly 13 minutes. More importantly, she had done so while maintaining the kind of calm professionalism that the instructors were looking for in potential SEALs. As she climbed out of the pool, water streaming from her equipment, Sarah caught the eye of several other candidates. Some looked inspired by her performance, others appeared intimidated by the standard she had set. But Sarah's focus was already shifting to the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove that she belonged in the elite community of naval special warfare operators. Chief Harrison approached her as she began to remove her equipment, his expression still giving nothing away. "Good start, Martinez," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of professional approval. "But this was just the beginning. Tomorrow we find out if you can do it again when you're tired, when you're stressed, and when the stakes are higher." Sarah nodded, understanding that she had passed the first test, but knowing that many more challenges lay ahead. The path to becoming a SEAL was measured not in single achievements, but in sustained performance under increasingly difficult conditions. Today had been about proving she could maintain her composure under pressure. Tomorrow would test whether she could do it repeatedly when exhaustion and stress had worn down her mental defenses. As she walked toward the equipment cleaning station, Sarah reflected on what she had learned about herself during the exercise. The calm she had maintained wasn't just a product of her training, though that had been essential. It came from a deeper understanding that panic was always a choice, and that choosing to remain calm, even when every instinct screamed otherwise, was perhaps the most important skill any special operator could possess. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and she could hear the next candidate being called to the pool edge. The training would continue, each person facing the same fundamental test of mental resilience that had been the cornerstone of SEAL training for decades. Some would pass, others would discover that their limits were lower than they had believed. But Sarah Martinez had taken the first step toward proving that she possessed the rare combination of physical capability and mental toughness that define naval special warfare operators. The water had tested her, and she had emerged not just intact, but stronger and more confident in her ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead in her journey toward earning the coveted SEAL Trident.